Welcome to the Hennepin-University Partnership webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Inequality and Longevity, Understanding Black-White Differences in How Long People Live, and it's presented by Dr. Elizabeth Wrigley-Field. My name is Sophie Latkins, and I'm a graduate assistant with the Hennepin-University Partnership. We are also joined by HUP Senior Project Manager, Margaret Stumbo-Turvey. The Hennepin-University Partnership is a strategic partnership between the University of Minnesota and Hennepin County that aims to connect these organizations at points of mutual benefit. We aim to catalyze research partnerships, engage students by providing experiences that enrich learning and build a future workforce, and share expertise, best practices, and knowledge, something we hope we'll do today. Before we get started, just a few Zoom reminders for our audience. Your video, audio, and chat are not enabled. If you need any support from the HUP team, please use the Q&A function. If you'd like to ask a question, you can submit that through the Q&A function. We will monitor for questions throughout and save time to address them at the end. And this webinar is being recorded. A huge thank you to our presenter for sharing her time and research with us, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please look for an email from hup@umn.edu with a survey and a link to the recorded webinar video tomorrow. And finally, we are so glad to welcome and introduce the presenter. Dr. Elizabeth Wrigley-Field is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Sociology and the Minnesota Population Center. A sociologist and demographer, she studies racial inequity and mortality in the historical and contemporary United States and specializes in finding comparisons and metrics that illuminate the human meaning of mortality disparities. And now I will turn it over to her for the presentation.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm really pleased to be here with you all. Before anything else, I want to just acknowledge that all of the research I'm going to show that was done by me, I'll be talking about research by me and by others, but all of it done by me was supported by the Minnesota Population Center through a center grant that they have from the National Institutes of Health. And it's because of these center grants from the federal government, from NIH, that work like mine is possible. And I want to acknowledge that because all of those grants are threatened now, and I very much hope that they will continue. Among the stories of violence that Margaret Burnham recounts in her book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, is a series of incidents in Alabama's Union Springs in 1945. There was a stretch of Black businesses that included a shop and cafe owned by Edgar Bernard Thomas, and next door, a barber shop owned by the Reverend James L. Pinckney. One day, Thomas's business was visited by two police officers, one of them, who was interested in a woman who Thomas was romantically linked to, murdered him. Reverend Pinckney heard the other officer say, "We're going to run this damn town. I'll kill every Black son of a bitch in the street." The police chief visited him later that day and warned him to get out of town. So he did. He fled to Chicago. He never returned. This talk is about Black and white mortality rates in the contemporary United States, but I started with this small story for a reason. The tragedies and injustices that were enacted on Thomas and Pinckney in just this one day in October 1945 illustrate a core aspect of Jim Crow, which was the intertwining of theft and violence. Pinckney lost his business and his home. Thomas lost his life. Among the consequences of the widespread racial terror recounted in Burnham's extensively documented history are an immense loss of wealth among Black Americans who'd sought to amass security through businesses and property, and also the losses of life that facilitated many of those thefts. And I start here because I think these linked thefts, the theft of wealth, the theft of life, those work together in the foundations of America's systems of racial domination. And to me, that's a reminder to us to think broadly about self-determination as the core idea that we're trying to get at. Like, who gets to control their life and in what ways is what we're talking about on the broadest level when we talk about mortality differences. And that's a point that I'll return to at the end of this talk. But the specific question that I'm focused on today is, how big are Black-white lifespan disparities? How do we know? What does that mean? And this might seem like a question with an incredibly obvious answer. So before the COVID pandemic, the non-Hispanic white-black gap in life expectancy at birth was 4 years. In 2020, it was almost 6 years. In 2021, 5.5 years. 2022, a little less than 5 years. So it's been coming down, not quite back to normal of 4 years. So okay, so that's the answer, right? Like this straightforward question, straightforward answer, it would seem. One problem is it's actually really hard to get our heads around what a life expectancy gap of, let's say, 4 years actually means and what it's telling us. Life expectancy turns out to be a super weird measure. So let me just take a moment and tell you how it works. And if you already know how it works, hopefully this is also going to just ground you a little bit in the specific lifespan differences we're talking about. So this graph shows the ages at death that are used to calculate life expectancy. And here it's for non-Hispanic Black and white populations in 2 years, 2014 and 2020. And I'm going to spend a little bit of a chunk of time just explaining this graph because it's going to ground us in what I think is the more interesting discussion that's going to follow. So for example, when you see here these curves peaking at a little above age 80, that's telling us that the most common age at death is in the early 80s. Now, I'm simplifying something here, which is that in the actual population, we have like really big baby boom groups of people, and then we have other birth years that were much smaller. And so, if you just looked at ages at death in the population, you'd see a lot of deaths happening just at whatever ages boomers happen to be right then because they're such a large group of people. That's not what's going on here. These curves basically adjust for that. So think of this as just the ages of death that come just straight out of the mortality rates. You see this big spike at the end. That's because this final group is ages 100 plus. So it's grouping a lot of ages together. So that's a little bit artificial. You also see this spike at the beginning. That is not artificial. That's infant deaths. And that's something that I'll return to momentarily. 2014 was the year that life expectancy was its highest ever in the United States. That was true for the total US population. It was true for white people. It was true for Black people. In the last 10 years, we've never again had mortality rates as good as we had it back in 2014. And so the 2014 lines are shown here in sky blue for white people and in pink for Black people. And so that white peak in the early 80s being much higher than the Black peak is telling us that more white people live long enough to die at those early 80s ages. So this makes sense, right? And you can see this pink line for the Black population kind of poking out to the left. That's telling us that at ages 45, 50, 60, 65, Black people are dying at a much higher rate than white people are. Okay, so the other year on this graph is 2020, the first year of the COVID pandemic, and also the year that COVID deaths were most unequal. And that is this green or like teal line for white people and the orange line for Black people, which you can see is much, much, much worse in the Black population than the 2014 line was. A lot of that was COVID, especially at these older ages, but you also see a big spike of Black deaths in 2020 at around like 20 years old. That's not COVID, that's homicide and drug deaths and other things. Okay, so now that I've grounded us in these curves, let me tell you sorry, I have to move my Zoom screen out of the way, that life expectancy is the average age of death for these curves. And if you just think about what that means in terms of 2020, I think that makes it especially easy to see that this is actually kind of a weird thing to do. So it's the average age of death that a group of people would have if it were always 2020. So they have 2020 as infant mortality death rates when they're infants, and 2020 is adolescent death rates when they're adolescents, and the COVID old age death rates when they're at old ages, and so on. And of course, no actual group of people ever experiences that. So life expectancy is, in that sense, a pretty artificial measure. So when we were talking about these life expectancy differences of 4 years or 6 years, it's a 4 or 6 year difference from this kind of strange thought experiment, which is not that satisfying. And so the question of this talk is, how do we find an answer to this fundamental question? How big is this lifespan gap between Black and white people? We have this sense that this is a meaningful thing. How do we find an answer that is concrete enough to give us real insights into what these disparities are telling us about real people's lives and experiences of the world? And I'm going to argue that there are basically three strategies for doing that, one of which is very conventional, one of which is very unconventional, and then one is kind of in between. And so we're going to go in the order of starting from the one that is very conventional for social scientists like me, and then get sort of weirder as we go. The framework for these three strategies is drawn from an article that I have coming out maybe as soon as next week in the annual review of sociology. And so you'll see some empirical work done by me, but also a lot done by other people. Okay, so the first strategy is what I'm calling distribution-based approaches. And this is basically like, let's quantify the lifespan gap. Let's summarize those curves that I was just showing you, but make it more meaningful by giving some better kind of summary than just the average age at death. And this approach has given us a lot of, I would say, absolutely crucial facts. So, for example, 40% of Black deaths over the course of the 20th century were excess, meaning that they were premature compared with if the Black population had the white population's death rates. So this huge bulk of deaths in the Black population is really unequal deaths. In more recent decades, it's a little lower, but still 1 in 3 Black deaths, just very high excess mortality. Life tables even imply that 1 in 38 Black men eventually die of some kind of death linked to firearms. That's even before there was a big rise of homicides during the COVID pandemic. It reflects homicide rates 20 times higher than white men. 1 in 1,000 Black men eventually die of an encounter with the police. A fact I think is just staggering. And as a last example of stylized facts, I'm going to show you an example from a work that I have in progress with a wonderful Minnesota PhD named Kwa Vu. I'm going to show you just a little bit of this project. So this graph is showing the lifespan gap at different points in the lifespan distribution. I'll explain what that means from 1980 to 2023. And so the purple line here is the median. And what that means is we're going to compare the median death rate for white people the median age at death for white people to the median age at death for Black people. And you can see back in 1980, they're about 5 years apart. Then it's shrinking a little bit over time, and then it spikes up quite a bit in 2020. Now, the really huge gap here that you see, this light pink line, is the first percentile. And what that's telling us is that back in 1980, the shortest lifespans, meaning the people who are like the bottom 1% of how long they live, died at the same age regardless of their race. But by around 2010, the white first percentile was 20 years longer than the Black first percentile. And I'll show you why that happened in just a moment. At the other end, at the very bottom, the longest lifespans, the 90th percentile, those were pretty much identical until the COVID pandemic spiked them up. So this is another look at the same thing. Now it's just showing the two separate lifespans, white and Black, at their respective percentiles. So here, this is the 90th, right? And you can see why that 90th percentile gap grew. Black lifespans were pulled down in 2020 across almost the entire lifespan distribution. The whole thing just shifted down. People just died at much younger ages. And now we can see in the upper left exactly what was happening in those youngest deaths, the first percentile of lifespans. In 1980, there was no gap because 1% of both white babies and Black babies did not live longer than their first year of life. That rapidly changed for white babies. So by 2010, the bottom percentile is now living into their 20s, while the bottom 1% of Black babies still dies as babies. And as far as I've been able to tell, that has been true in every single year of US history, that more than 1% of Black births does not make it to their first birthday. This whole talk is about really sad things. I think that is the single hardest statistic that I'm going to show. So I gave you this kind of extended illustration for a couple of reasons. One is just so that we have some shared grounding together in basic numbers as we come to less conventional approaches. And the other is just to illustrate that while you might think like, oh, we've been studying lifespan gaps forever, surely we know exactly how to do it. Even within the realm of these sort of conventional types of measures, we're still actually trying to find new ways of looking at these statistics. So in my essay, there's been this explosion, I would say, of newer methods of quantifying and comparing lifespans, even just within the last 5 years. So in my essay, I tried to comprehensively identify the kinds of lifespan measures that you can use that are sort of distributional in this way, just like how do we compare the age at death in Black and white populations mathematically. I found some 72 measures that people use. This is just a tiny bit of them on the slide for illustration. Um, that's a lot, and if you're able to see the years here, you'll see a lot of articles in like 2022, 2023, 2024. It feels to me like our field of people who study lifespans is not really satisfied with the tools we have for thinking about lifespan gaps. And so there's this enormous energy for trying to invent new ones. Some of that reflects an attempt to grapple with a paradox. And the paradox is that on the one hand, the Black and white lifespan gap is pretty big. It's about the same size as the male-female lifespan gap in the United States. It's about double the rural-urban gap. It's about the same size as the pre-pandemic life expectancy gap between the United States and then like Spain or Italy. These are all pretty big gaps. And at the same time, by one estimate, the between race variation accounts for just 1% of the total lifespan variation between a pooled population of Black and white people. So like if you put all Black and white people, put all their lifespans into a pot and like draw people out randomly, only 1% of the variation between different people is statistically associated with what race they are. That's very small. Now, there's an important response to that says, actually the way that we think about those questions isn't quite right. Like when we do this sort of conventional separating variation into between group and within group variation, we're missing that what a lot of social group actually does is structure how much variation there is within each group. So another way of saying that is what part of what it means to be Black in the United States is not just dying at a younger age, but dying at a more variable age. Your lifespan is less predictable. And if we allow that to be part of the meaning of what racial stratification is doing, then, okay, race can account not for 1%, but like 20% of the individual variation in lifespans. So a lot more than 1%, but also, far from being a majority. And this reflects something that I think is really important, which is that for almost any given cause of death, Black deaths occur at a wider span of ages than white lifespans do. In particular, they reach into substantially younger ages. So this is actually a major feature of lifespan inequality. If you are white, it's much more predictable that you have a good chance of living into a much older age. And I think this kind of reflects maybe a wider phenomenon that we're grappling with, which is that if lifespans, this paradox reflects that if lifespans are hard to predict, that actually kind of makes them like other social outcomes. It's hard to predict what marriages will last, or it's hard to predict what children's outcomes will be like as they grow up. It's hard to predict who's going to get a high-paying job out of college. All of these things, even with really good data and really good machine learning algorithms, we actually can't predict what happens to individual people very well at all. And so I think life and death, there's some sense in which they might both be sort of more random and rooted in luck than a lot of our social science easily admits. Okay, so some of this innovation maybe is grappling with this paradox, but the point I want to leave us with on this part is that these are all kind of conventional approaches to thinking about lifespans because they're based in thinking that if we just found the right way to structure our statistics, we could find a number that describes those curves I showed you that would tell us what these lifespan gaps mean. But that is not the only strategy for trying to wrest meaning out of these disparities. Another one that I have used in my work is what I've taken to calling comparative approaches. And the idea is none of us has objective foundations for understanding the scale of most risks. And so we benchmark, we calibrate our sense of risk by comparing to other risks to see like, is that big? Is that small? And the work that I am most known for within my discipline is an example of this. So it was mid 2020, and I asked, how bad would the COVID-19 pandemic need to be for white people in order for white mortality in this historic pandemic to be like Black mortality is every year in the United States? And what I found is that it would take at least 400,000 pandemic deaths for white people in 2020 or any other year in order to make white mortality look like Black mortality was way back in its best year, which we remember was 2014. And that number, 400,000 pandemic deaths, just in the white population, that was unimaginable to me at the time in summer 2020. As it turned out, we did not reach that in 2020. We did in 2021. That was the only year that white death rates were higher than Black death rates are, even when there's no pandemic. But to me, the force of this comparison of like everyday Black mortality to pandemic mortality is that at that time in 2020, we did so much to try to limit pandemic deaths. We as individuals who gave up a lot, and also our major institutions that we're part of, really, like including universities like mine, transformed ourselves in ways that we would not have previously thought possible in order to try to limit those pandemic deaths. For a period of time, it felt like any number of things could be on the table. We would just do what had to be done. And that is not the same approach that we have had to this same level of this pandemic scale death experienced by Black Americans every single year. The reason that I thought to ask this question in the first place is in 2020 is that my co-authors and I actually had already found out that this had been true a century earlier in the 1918 flu. So this was the historic pandemic of the 20th century, the 1918 flu. And in US cities, white death rates at the height of that pandemic were still lower than Black death rates were every year. And we found this back in 2019. When we discovered this, we actually thought we had made a mistake. Like we checked it a lot of different ways, but it is true. And later we realized that this sort of analogy of ordinary year in, year out Black mortality in that era to the 1918 scale pandemic mortality for white people, that analogy actually ran deeper than we had even understood ourselves. The 1918 pandemic was so horrifying, partly because of the sheer scale of death, but also because it killed people really young in their 20s and 30s. And we realized that this was also true of Black mortality every year in that era, not because of flu, but because of tuberculosis, that Black tuberculosis deaths at young adult ages, year in, year out, were similar to white 1918 pandemic flu deaths. And what that meant in practice was things like this. This is a letter to an advice column in the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a weekly Black newspaper in 1932. I'm a young man just finishing my profession and had hoped to make a great success of life, but I've developed tuberculosis and have not many years to live if things keep on as they've started. I love a sweet little girl and she loves me. Do you think I ought to tell her that I cannot marry her? You see, we'd have puny children and I would not live long enough to educate them. She would be a widow before so long, and that's that. What should I do? And you can actually find similar letters in advice columns in the Chicago Defender, in the Amsterdam News in Harlem, and other major Black newspapers of the time asking, should I marry her? Can I marry him? Is it fair for me to have children because I have tuberculosis? And that is what this 1918 every year phenomenon meant for Black Americans in cities, not just really high mortality, but extraordinarily high mortality in the ages when people were establishing their lives, dreaming of their futures, maybe establishing their deepest ties to other people. Okay, so that kind of comparison, for example, between ordinary mortality and pandemic mortality That's what I'm calling this comparative approach. And there are other versions, right? Like another is we could benchmark mortality disparities by translating them into the universal liquid metric, meaning money, right? So we translate lifespans into monetary value in a huge array of contexts, ranging from insurance to cost benefit analyses to court cases. We do it with very, very little consistency across contexts. But that is another way of sort of borrowing meaning to attach to a quantity that we don't have an easy intuition for. The last kind of approach is to try to confront mortality disparities meaning directly by spelling out what lost lifespans mean in human terms. And so I want to argue that losing time or an untimely death is a distinctive harm because of how the meanings that we make of our lives unfold in time. And I'm going to give you the sort of selected bullet points version of what I mean by that. So here we go. If Black people lived as long as white people, the US electorate would be less tilted toward white people. For example, this analysis led by Javier Rodriguez combined mortality rates with race-specific voter turnout rates in specific states and specific years, and estimated that Black excess mortality compared with white people meant 1 million lost Black votes in the 2004 election, 87% of which would have gone to John Kerry, not George W. Bush. They identify 7 US Senate and 11 gubernatorial elections won by Republicans, where hypothetical Black voters who were missing because they had died would have swung the election the other way. And that figure of 7 Senate seats is comparable to kind of famous other estimates of the electoral consequences of barring people with a felony conviction record from voting. They note that these elections were particularly consequential for policies like whether to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. If Black people lived as long as white people, the United States would have a richer collective memory of Black cultural traditions and political movements. Lost lifespans are a lost population link to the past. Premature deaths rob us of our collective memory. For example, the loss of mostly Black jazz and blues musicians during the COVID pandemic is a loss of musical traditions, networks, knowledge, and future innovation. In this news article, one musician put it like this: every time you lose a legend, you lose a library. We social scientists have not yet estimated how much memory of, for example, the civil rights movement was lost to the pandemic. If Black people lived as long as white people, Black people would have more time with their loved ones. Deb Umberson, a sociologist, and colleagues found that across a wide variety of kin relationships, Black people were between 50% and 300% more likely to experience kin loss. And sociologist Ashton Verdery and his colleagues found that in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, every death meant on average that 9 people experienced a bereavement of close kin. Of course, we know those deaths were very disproportionately in Black families. One reason this matters so much is that it robs us of what I think of as one of the most deeply meaningful human experiences, which is the chance to see ourselves and our loved ones at different stages of life, the chance to be known in different versions of ourselves. So in her memoir, Ashley Ford reports thinking when her beloved grandmother dies, she thinks, "You're going to miss it," I thought. "I'm going to be so much better than I am now, and you're not going to be here to see it." So these are some of death's losses. There are others. If Black people lived as long as white people, fewer Black people would experience proximity to violence. For example, we know from the Boston Reentry Study, which is a very careful and systematic study of people leaving prison in Boston, that study found that 40% of the recently incarcerated respondents had witnessed somebody being killed during their childhood. 60% reported the violent death of a close friend or family member at some point in their lives. Just absolutely ubiquitous exposure to homicide. We also know from some work by the sociologist Patrick Sharkey that homicides in a kid's neighborhood harm children's cognitive development and their behavior at school, even in the short term, even if they didn't personally witness the homicide. So it's enough to sort of be close to it. And a book that really drives this home to me is Brothers in Grief, which is it's by the sociologist Nora Gross. It's her ethnography of a Black boys' charter school in Philadelphia, where in the time that she was participating in the life of the school as a researcher, multiple boys were killed by gunfire. And her account includes this indelible image of students changing from one memorial t-shirt into another as one student's funeral fell on the same day as another student's memorial birthday event. If Black people lived as long as white people, fewer Black people would be or would feel culpable for someone else's death. And my idea here is that losing close kin and vicarious experiences of violence are not the only ways that someone can have a traumatic relationship to someone else's death. Another way is by feeling responsible for it. So let's think for a moment about street design. Black neighborhoods are less likely to have safe pedestrian crossings, less likely to have adequate lighting, more likely to be near high-speed arterials. We measure the impact of these design choices through deaths. So we know that per mile traveled, Black Americans are about twice as likely as white Americans to die while they're driving or walking, and 4.5 times more likely to die on a bicycle. We don't measure the impact through surviving, let alone being responsible for, a fatal collision. But that experience, what the New Yorker headline writers called the sorrow and the shame of the accidental killer, that can radically alter the sense of self, social standing, and the sense of safety of people who experience it. Those are also consequences of designing streets, especially in Black neighborhoods, to not prioritize life. A cause of death that famously might leave other people feeling culpable is suicide. That's actually one of very few causes of death that is not disproportionately experienced by Black Americans. Most accidental forms of death are. I think that felt culpability for other people's deaths is a really underexplored aspect of the COVID pandemic. The scale of the deaths and also the centrality of household transmission of COVID imply to me that many, many people must know or suspect that they gave COVID to a loved one who ultimately died. And so all the facts that we already know about just how unequal the COVID death tolls were, to me, they also hint at this unequal burden of what must be a really devastating and life-altering experience. But the contours, the prevalence of this experience are not things that social scientists or health scientists have really explored. If Black people lived as long as white people, more Black people would get to retire. For example, an estimated 76% of Black people live to age 65, compared with 84% of white people. Retirement systems that use measures like penalties for early withdrawal in order to adjust for the fact that in general people are living longer, but they don't take account of how unequally lifespans are distributed. Those kinds of systems are not, in the words of Miguel Sanchez Romero and colleagues, they're not actuarially fair. In fact, they can function to redistribute wealth from non-white to white populations. So in 2020, pandemic mortality led to a loss of projected Social Security wealth, meaning it's the wealth that people didn't get because they died sooner than they would have. That loss was more than 11% of the total projected Social Security wealth for Black populations, but less than 5% for white populations. There are lots of caveats to this, right? So like experiencing retirement as a distinctive stage of your life is not just about living long enough. It's also about what your economic circumstances are. Do you have enough money to retire? Also, dropping out of the workforce doesn't necessarily reflect a decision to retire. It can also just reflect a lack of desirable work. And so I mentioned these caveats about retirement actually as a stand-in for all of these bullet points that should have similar caveats, right? Like potential outcomes are not always realized. Realized outcomes can mean more than one thing. All those caveats apply. But to me, the point remains that universal entitlements are not actually so universal without an entitlement to live long enough to collect them. If Black people lived as long as white people, more Black people would have the chance to change their minds and behaviors in ways they find meaningful, and more would have the chance to reconcile after relationship ruptures. For just one small example, there's a really characteristic age patterning of criminal activity, which is that it peaks when people are adolescents and young adults, and then it falls. So people naturally kind of age out of committing crimes, most people. And this age pattern generates a really distinctive and meaningful experience for many, many people of any race who've ever engaged in criminal behaviors, which is the experience of becoming someone who no longer does that. Experiences like that occur on a spectrum of, very dramatic to super mundane experiences of just growing into greater maturity. These are often highly salient when people recount what their own life has been about. This is actually where a lot of the sort of meaning that we ascribe to our lives comes from, is these experiences of developing and changing in these ways. Another really meaningful way of changing your mind or having someone else change their mind is achieving a reconciliation after an estrangement. So estrangement is really, really common in one big social survey that social scientists use a lot called Ad Health. 1/4 of the Ad Health respondents are estranged from at least one of their parents at least one time in their lives. So super common, but reconciliation is really common too. But dying too soon can mean just actually not having that chance to reconcile. Rehabilitation and reconciliation are two major ways that people enact what the psychologist Dan McAdams argues is the core American narrative, which is redemption. So in other words, in the United States, we have cultural and symbolic tools that allow us to feel very kind of satisfied with our lives and achieve a sense of meaning when our lives conform to a very common patterning that takes years or decades to play out these sort of redemptive experiences. Those cultural goods, those experiences become accessible to us through time because they intrinsically involve this kind of trajectory. And in that vein, my colleague at the U, Michael Walker, gives a really enlightening discussion of the strategies that jail residents use to manage the loss of narratives that comes from in their lives that come from being incarcerated, and just how dislocating that experience is. So I want to conclude, I want to kind of step back and reflect on this third strategy, in particular, these meaning-based measures. When I was thinking about these, I took a lot of inspiration from memoirs and essays by Black authors, especially the ones on the screen here. And I especially want to highlight this passage from Between the World and Me. It struck me that perhaps the defining feature of being drafted into the Black race was the inescapable robbery of time, because the moments we spent readying the mask or readying ourselves to accept half as much could not be recovered. The robbery of time is not measured in lifespan, but in moments. It is the last bottle of wine that you have just uncorked but do not have time to drink. It is the kiss that you do not have time to share before she walks out of your life. It is the raft of second chances for them and 23-hour days for us. And to me, one way of reading these like meaning-based metrics that I'm offering as a way to think about lifespans is an attempt to take up this challenge. Could we actually measure the loss of lifespan, the robbery of lifespan, as this loss of meaningful moments? The meaning-based approaches to lifespan disparities have a lot in common with a lot of strains of social thought that, including ones we often don't engage with much in sociology. Like in philosophy, there's a capabilities perspective associated with people like Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who put it as the dead don't do much. Right? Meaning like you have to be alive to achieve the other things you want from your life, or philosophical traditions that see control over time as a precondition for democratic flourishing. These approaches also have a lot in common with things we do pay a lot of attention to in my branches of social science, including that there's a lot of ways that time is structurally granted to some people and denied to others, right? So it's also about incarceration and commuting times and administrative burdens that you have to fulfill in order to access state services and all kinds of other things too. Death is only the most totalizing of these. Time loss also parallels other ways of not being able to spend your life on what you want to spend it on, like losing the chance to turn your energy and your attention toward your own goals and concerns. And there's a lot of social science on this in different contexts. In the context of household labor, we talk about cognitive labor. In the context of poverty, we talk about the bandwidth tax. So like lots of different concepts for different contexts. But I particularly like the way that the writer Amy Berkowitz kind of captures this idea. She imagines a series of paintings titled Brilliant Women Talking About Rape Again instead of talking about their art or any other topic. And that brings us back to kind of where I started, thinking about self-determination, right? So one way I sometimes put this is if wealth is our best kind of proxy for power, then I would argue that time, how much time we get, how much we get to control it, might be our best single proxy for freedom. And so thinking about how freedom or how control over our time is distributed brings us back to those questions from the beginning about, this is about our self-determination. It might sit uneasily with some of you to instrumentalize death by talking partly about its consequences for other people, even about electoral contests. In truth, it sits uneasily with me, right? So if history is written by the victors, I think we could say social science is written by the survivors. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the biggest loss is always to the person who loses their life, not to everybody else. But I do think that we might better understand what mortality disparities are telling us by trying to actually name their harms systematically. The unknowability of what anyone would do with their lives in the end is the meaning-based measure, like this kind of approach's biggest challenge. But I think it's also probably an untimely death's greatest loss. An exhibition displayed, I don't know if it's still displayed, given the way this museum is sort of being dismantled, but that was recently displayed at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, features a flight suit once worn by Trayvon Martin, who had dreamed of working in aviation. He attended and later volunteered at an aviation summer camp. No one can know whether he would have achieved that goal, whether it would have been supplanted by others, what he would have made of his life. The exhibition invites viewers to contemplate this very unknowability. Artistic and literary works find ways to make something as abstract as lost potential into something as concrete as a murdered child's beloved uniform. Quantitative social science measurements, like I specialize in, might never achieve the same thing, but we could try. So that's what I'm trying to do, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wrigley-Field, for your presentation. As a reminder, you guys, all of our audience can ask questions using the Q&A function. We have our first question here, and it is, how does income or wealth impact lifespans across and between races?
This is a great question, and it's one where social scientists who've studied this, like sociologists and economists in particular, do not all agree with each other. Some of the things that I think we can say for sure are that there is a tremendous impact of wealth in particular on health and longevity. It especially is consequential for children to grow up in poverty. That is a very strong predictor of longevity. And also that it seems unlikely that this is the whole story. And so a couple of ways that I'll elaborate on that point. One is that there's a lot of work showing that the lifespan gaps between racial groups are actually largest among wealthier and higher income people. And one interpretation of this is that if you are a relatively high income, if you're a really rich Black person, you end up in social settings with other really rich people, and very few of them are Black. And so you end up in situations where you experience a lot of interpersonal racism that you might be more protected from actually with less money. And if you think about that explanation, to me, it's very telling because what it's telling us is that the consequences of wealth are not just about the wealth that you have as an individual, but about how wealth is distributed in your society more broadly. And so it's possible that wealth is not completely protective for people in a context where it's mostly held by white people, but that actually, if it were broadly more equal, it would be more protective, more equally protective as well. There's one other study I want to mention that I think really bears on this in a way I think is important, which is one important source of inequity in health is about what happens to you in the medical system. And that's something that's not necessarily directly impacted by your economic resources. And so there's a wonderful study by an economist, Marcella Olson, and she did something incredibly ambitious, which is she set up her own, she set up a medical clinic in Oakland for low-income people. And one of the things she found is that Black men who who went to this clinic, if they had Black doctors, they had much better health outcomes than if they had white or Asian doctors. And you could see it in the doctor's notes, even that the kinds of interactions they were having, the way they were thinking about their patients was really different. And it was reflected then in the patient's willingness to to take preventative health measures, like taking a daily medication, for example. And she finds this huge health consequence of this. So this is an amazing study. And it on the one hand, it sort of tells us like maybe if we want to think about these disparities, we don't need to equalize everything, but we want to really focus on what's happening inside the health system. But you might also think to yourself, like, well, the context in which taking these, preventative health measures, like taking a blood pressure medication, for example, the context in which that's so protective is also a context in which the rest of your life is putting you at a lot of health risk because most of us, don't need to be going to a doctor all the time. Some people do, but for a lot of people, like that wouldn't be so consequential. It's in the context where you're at all these health risks that what happens to you in the medical system can be sort of make or break. And so I use these two kinds of findings that I think to kind of illustrate the difficulty of giving a clear answer to this question, because what happens in the medical system and outside of it, what happens with the way wealth is distributed, and is it about you or the rest of your society, they're all wrapped up with each other. And so it's very hard to kind of isolate a single factor and say, like, that's what's really driving the disparities without looking at the whole picture.
Great, thank you. We'll give another minute for our audience to ask any questions using the Q&A function.
While we wait, I also have a question. Hopefully I'm trying to kind of wrap my mind around how to ask it, but I'm curious. I appreciated your point at the end of like quantitative scholars, have this different approach to the example that you gave of the uniform of Trayvon Martin's. And I'm curious, and maybe the answer is to read the article when it comes out next week. Congratulations. But I'm curious kind of with all of this information that you just presented on, like where we go from here, or kind of what's next, having done all of this thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a COVID researcher in large part. I've done a lot of my research is about COVID mortality, who's died of COVID in Minnesota, outside, in the United States as a whole, and how does that impact death rates going forward. And in all that work, you sort of take it for granted, like the outcome is death. And one of the things this made me think a lot about is like there's a lot of other aspects of experience that these deaths are sort of like a marker for. And so, that's what I was thinking about when I talked about, do you feel culpable for someone else's death? Like, I think that we have in the United States population now this incredibly widespread experience of feeling that you might have given COVID to somebody you care about who died. And this is an experience that we almost never talk about. We don't have real measures of how common is this, who is it happened to, how is it impacting people. But it just thinking through the numbers, it feels like this has to be an experience that a lot of people have had, and what a devastating experience. And so I think part of this for me is for us, people like me who I analyze the mortality statistics. That's my job. I'm a demographer. It's sort of a challenge to think a little bit more about what are all of the experiences that are lurking behind the measurement that we take.
Thank you.
Our next question here is, how can your research be utilized to demonstrate the impact these life expectancy gaps are having on constraining the U.S. economy? For example, impact on GDP.
This is a great question, and I will not have a satisfying answer for you because my answer is going to be it's complicated. And some of the reasons that it's complicated is that it to think about what would the impact on GDP be if people were living longer, you have to get really specific about what exactly are we imagining is happening instead. So to give a kind of obvious example, like if you're just sort of having people live longer, but it's time that they're in a nursing home in memory care, this will not be helping GDP. If what we're imagining is that we are looking at the number of Americans that dies at much younger ages, really quite early ages. So a research article that I published recently shows that the United States is sort of alone in the world since the COVID pandemic. Our mortality for people aged 25 to 44 has stayed really high. It went down since the pandemic, but not by that much. And it's significantly higher than the trajectory that it was on before the pandemic. Deaths at ages 25 to 44, that's going to impact GDP a lot, presumably, because those are prime years where people would be economically productive. They're years when people often have families that they're supporting. And so the impact on those families and then their potential productivity, right? So that's a very different kind of situation to be imagining redressing. I'm not an economist, and so I think sort of pointing out those complications about what exactly is the mortality we're talking about is probably the best version of an answer that I can give you to that. I'm sorry, it's not more satisfying.
Let's see. I got a couple questions coming at the same time, so give me 1 second to to read them. Someone says, I see so much potential for the research you shared in helping people share the story behind the data and telling the story and narrative in a way that gets to the heart space where motivation lives. What are your thoughts on how to use this in our work?
Thank you for that question. I think, I know that people who are on this webinar have a really wide variety of work that we do. And I think maybe the sort of broad lesson here that would apply in a lot of different circumstances is to try to challenge ourselves to use whatever is the type of data that we're most comfortable with, to challenge ourselves to also think about what we would learn from other very different types. So for me I work with the statistics all the time. I was reading these memoirs and these ethnographies that really helped me think in a more serious way about what am I actually measuring when I measure my statistics. And I also think I know a lot of people who are in the other camp where their stats class was the worst experience they ever had, and are very comfortable on the level of individual stories. And then I think the challenge then is to try to connect those stories with some of these facts. I talked about this one a fair amount, but it has so much meaning to me that as far as I can tell, and I've worked a lot with historical vital statistics data, in every year of US history, including today, more than 1% of Black babies has not lived out its first year of life. That is a statistical fact, that packs its own kind of punch and is something I think that uh, that we have to grapple with in terms of the enormity of grief and suffering and lost potential that it entails. And so, there's something I think about the story approach and the sort of let's really get the facts right and crystallize the numbers approach that they're just such different strengths, and there's something different, distinct that we get when we put them together.
Great. And then we only have a couple minutes left, so this is probably one of our last questions, but if people are interested in partnering with you on applied research projects or consultation services, what would be the best way to connect?
Oh, sure. So I'm easy to reach. My email address at the U is ewf@umn.edu. And I would be glad to talk with any of you. If I'm not the right person to help you out, I will try to connect you with who is.
And this is a great segue for me because I will be sending out an email to all of you tomorrow. It'll be from hup@umn.edu, and I'll include some contact information for Dr. Wrigley-Field, as well as a survey for you that you can fill out to share about how this experience was for you. So we're just about at time. Dr. Wrigley-Field, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close out?
No, just thank you for the questions, and I'm so appreciative to have the opportunity to speak with you all.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. And a huge thank you to Dr. Wrigley-Field for sharing her time and research at the HUP webinar series.